Hey guys, my name is Vindicator, and today I'm going to be making a tutorial for you guys explaining the very basics of the StarCraft 2 editor. So just in case you don't know where the StarCraft 2 editor is, let's go ahead and show you where it's at. If you've got StarCraft 2 installed, all you got to do is click on your start button there, go to all programs, and then go to your StarCraft 2 folder, and right inside there's StarCraft 2, and there's the editor right next to it. So you can launch the editor from there if you ever needed to find it. And for this video, you really don't need to open up the editor and try to follow along with the video, because I'm not going to be creating anything. I'm just going to be explaining a lot of where stuff is and things like that to give you a good idea of how to maneuver through the editor. If you know, like I said, this is geared for beginners, so I'm going to go and assume that you don't hardly know anything. And even if you are experienced, hopefully you'll get a couple snippets here and there if you didn't know some specific details I might cover. So the first time you open up the editor, it should bring you to the terrain window, and I believe it makes a new map for you automatically. But let's go ahead and what I'm going to do here is click File New and explain all the different options you've got here when you make a new map. So there's 4 options initially. The first one's melee map. A melee map is just a custom terrain basically for a real StarCraft 2 game, not a custom game. A training map is the same thing as a melee map, except you've got a little more freedom on what you can modify with the editor to allow people to train the regular core StarCraft 2 game. Now an arcade map is where you can really do whatever the editor gives you the power to do. It's not made for playing regular StarCraft 2 per se. It's made for making whatever kind of a game you want to try to make. And then a mod file is not a map file. It's not a game itself, but when you're making a custom game, you can use mod files to store types of data. Like let's say you want custom models in your game, or custom 2D art, maybe for some custom UI, or just some images, who knows what. And maybe you'd want custom music. You can use mod files to store all these files, because currently right now, while I'm making this tutorial, the limit on, I believe, for maps is 20 megabytes. And mod files, you can have more than 100 megs in on one account. So you've got a lot more storage space in a mod file. So that's what they're for. Anyway, let me just go ahead and click on arcade map here, and on the next screen here you've got to choose your dependencies. What that means is, for example, right now it just says Wings of Liberty right here. I'm assuming after Heart of the Swarm and Legacy of the Void is released, you'll have 2 more little radio buttons below that to choose basically who you want to have access to your map. Do you want to have people who only own Heart of the Swarm, or do you want to have just people who own Wings of Liberty? And what that'll do is it'll limit what data you've got access to. For example, if Heart of the Swarm was released and I chose Wings of Liberty, you would not have access to the Heart of the Swarm assets. Then this campaign data checkbox down here, that allows you to have access to all of the cutscene, models, sounds, music, and data that is associated strictly with the campaign. For example, it's not just cutscene stuff, it's also in-game stuff like the Firebat. The Firebat was a campaign unit, so it's not accessible unless you have campaign data checked right there. And then to go a little more into detail here, if you click on Custom and then click on Modify, you have 4 standard dependencies to choose from. These are the 4 dependencies that came with Wings of Liberty, and it gives you a little bit of an explanation of what they are down here. Like this one says it's the primary data and assets for Wings of Liberty melee games. That most likely is probably some of the single player and also mostly the multiplayer for sure. Now, even though this one says Liberty Multi, that's a little misleading. You would think that it's the one that has all the multiplayer data. And what multi means there is when they release patches for StarCraft 2 and update, multiplayer balance and stuff like that, that's where all the changes go in that mod. So, for example, let's say when StarCraft 2 was released, the Marine had, I'm just making these numbers up, but let's say the Marine had 5 attack damage, attack power, and they balanced it so the Marine had 10 attack damage. Well, Liberty mod would always contain the Marine with the 5 damage, and then multi would contain the patch overrides pretty much that would change it to 10 damage. At least that's the way I understand it. I'm pretty sure that's accurate, but you know, who knows? Prove me wrong. I don't know. Anyway, okay. So Liberty Campaign has it's basically the checkbox we saw in the previous window that contains all the campaign assets. Well, I take that back. And then there's Liberty Story Campaign. So Liberty Campaign, it says, is the single player campaign. So Liberty Story is the one that has all of the cutscene assets and stuff like that. So because story mode, whenever you see the word story, that's usually the cutscenes and stuff. So basically what it looks like is when you click the checkbox here to include campaign data, what that's really doing is whoopsies, it is the equivalent of checking Liberty Campaign and Liberty Story Campaign. So anyway, so for now I'm just going to do that. Alright, the next screen here, this is where you choose the size of the map, and this can all be changed later. The vast majority of the stuff on this screen can be changed at a later time. So if you make your game 128 by 128 and it turns out that that's not enough space and you want to increase it later, you can do that. And then the use terrain checkbox here is just like what it sounds like. It defines whether your game has terrain in it or not, and at first glance that might be really weird. It's like, why would you want to make a game without terrain in it? Well, there is a good reason, at least that I've found, and that is if you are making, like, let's say custom UI for your game, a custom user interface, when you're positioning all that kind of stuff on your screen and everything, you've got to start StarCraft 2 over and over and over again a lot of times. And when there's no terrain in the game, it'll load a lot faster. So that's what I use it for. Also, if somebody is literally trying to make a custom game to the extent that it's only 2D and it doesn't even need terrain because of that, that'd be another reason somebody might not use terrain, and then everybody that plays it on Battle.net would be able to load it a lot faster. But but most of the time you're probably going to be using terrain. So, but it's just there as an option just in case. Then these texture sets down here, obviously they change the textures that you have to choose from in your map, but again, these are not final. If you like 7 of them and you want to change one to something else, you can do that later on. These aren't set in stone if you choose these. But what I will recommend is is checking all these out, because some of them have different skyboxes, and the skyboxes don't just contain sky. They also contain like planets and space in the background for some of the tile sets. And even though I do believe you can change that later on down the road if you don't like what you choose first, it's harder to change than the textures are, at least for me, because I don't remember off the top of my head how to do it. I know where skyboxes are, I'm not sure if it's easy to change them. So what I'd recommend is going through all these one time just to see what they look like and see which ones have, you know, the kind of sky you want in your map, and then choose a texture set based on what the skybox is. And then if you want to change the textures up to something else later on, go for it. And I'll definitely explain that in a tutorial coming pretty soon. But anyway, base height. Honestly, I don't know off the top of my head what that is there for. I mean, I know it changes the terrain height, but I don't know why you'd want to do that. I might have stumbled upon something a few months ago that gave me an inkling of why you'd want to do that, but I really can't remember off the top of my head. Random height down here. This is if you want to not have a completely flat terrain when you generate the map. Variability is the maximum and minimum values that the height differences will be on your terrain when you create it, and the strength is how quickly those variations occur. So if it's a low strength, you'll see very gradual changes between the minimum and maximum values that your variability shows. And if you have a high strength, you'll see very erratic and nearly instantaneous changes in terrain height. So more strength equals closer to like spikes. Less strength equals, if it's 0, it's going to be, I don't want to say flat, but because I don't know quite how much variability affects it, even if the strength is all the way down. But if you have less strength, it's smoother. That's all you got to know. So I'll show you a couple examples here. So I'll put let's put variability max. So that'll mean there'll be really tall and shallow differences. And let's put strength max just so you can see what it looks like here. I'll click next. And boom, there you go. Crazy, crazy spikes in the ground. It looks pretty cool, but then again, can't really do much with it when the whole map's like that. Now there definitely is a use for it, because if that was on the edges of the maps just to look cool in the background, that's definitely something that looks cool. And you could flatten this out very easily if you wanted to. So anyway, let me go back here and just show you the differences if I do less strength or less variability. Alright, so let's try 50-50 just so you have a good idea. So as you can see, you know, there's a few little hills, but it's definitely not anywhere close to what it was before, but it's still more interesting than a completely flat map would be. So that's what that's there for. So that's enough about making a new map. You know, I think I covered the options you've got there pretty extensively for this first tutorial. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about modules. Every blue icon at the top of the vast majority of the main module windows in the StarCraft 2 editor has these blue icons. The first one that we're on right now is terrain. The next one is triggers. Then there's data, text, import, AI, UI, cutscenes, and the overview manager. And these are also accessible right here in this modules drop down. So these buttons link to the exact same thing as this drop down. It's just whichever way you prefer to access them. And obviously all the shortcut keys are there too. I'll just cover a little bit of this terrain window here first. So the terrain window has different layers. The terrain layer is for, just like it sounds, modifying the terrain and you know, adding mountains and valleys and adding water. In 1.5, I believe they added the ability to put creep all over the place without like creep tumors and stuff generating it. I haven't messed with that on my own yet, but there's also some light generating things that you can put here. So you can make roads, and yeah, that's just for making your terrain. And you can use all the textures that are available to you from when you created the map. And like I said, those can be changed, and I'll explain that in a later tutorial. But the next layer in the terrain window here in the terrain module is units, and that's just like it sounds. It's for all the units that you've got available in the game. Quick note here: anything that starts with SM, that means story mode, I do believe, and that's from that's basically higher poly count things from the you know, the cutscenes in single player. The next layer is doodads. It's a kind of funny or weird word if it's the first time you've ever heard of it, but what doodads are is basically background stuff like rocks and trees, anything basically that's in the environment that you 90% of the time won't be interacting with. Maybe even 100%. I don't know if I want to say that or not. There might be a couple of exceptions, but anyway, it's mostly background stuff. Points allow you to place points. We'll go more into that later. There are things that you do not see in the game. Regions, again, are things that you don't see in the game, but they trigger things happening based on what you want to do. They're literally just, you know, circles and squares that when, for example, a unit could go into a region and something could happen based on that happening. So, but again, just trying to go over the extreme basics here for you. Cameras allow you to make cameras. If you're doing like cutscenes and stuff, you'll have cameras all over the place. If you want the camera to move, you might have, you know, you could have 2 different cameras in your game, and you could say when you're using camera A, you could have it pan to camera B over a certain number of seconds, but this isn't how you do anything with the cameras. This is just to create them and place them in your map. And then pathing is what defines where units can and can't move. And it looks like, based on my height being changed here, that it did some pathing stuff on its own. I can't remember what green is off the top of my head. Red means you can't move there. Green is something else. But anyway, we'll cover that more when I'll do a pathing tutorial. But anyway, so that's a good overview there for the terrain module. So obviously you understand, you know, if you want to make something that looks like something in your map, this is where you come to do it. This is where you add units and models and stuff. All right, let's go to the the trigger module. The trigger module, people with programming understanding will definitely pick up here faster than people without it, but at the same time, you don't need to know a programming language or anything to really be able to understand the trigger editor. I started doing StarCraft 2 custom games and I still to this day don't know a programming language, but I use the trigger editor every day that I'm using the StarCraft editor, and I'm doing just fine. It takes time, but as long as you exert the effort, you'll be able to figure it out. There's tons of tutorials available these days and materials to help you out. So anyway, just to give a quick basic understanding of what the trigger editor does, there's events, there's conditions, and there's actions. Events are things that happen, just like the word events sounds. Like, let's say unit dies. Any unit dies, whenever that happens now in this game, this trigger would run. You could under conditions say triggering unit equals Marine, then this trigger would only run if a Marine were to die. It would not run otherwise. And then actions are what happens when your trigger runs. And there's a plethora of things that you can define to happen. And that I'm not going to start going into that today. But all you really need to understand as a trigger editor is where you say, hey, when something happens, if these conditions match, do what I want to have happen. And conditions are optional also. You could just have any unit dies and then the actions run. So that's it for that. The data editor is very complex. There is a lot of stuff in the data module here. You know, down right here, I mean, it says modules and data, so you'd think it'd be called the data module, but a lot of people call it the data editor. I think I've heard Blizzard call it the data editor. So there's some conflicting, you know, terminology a little bit, but just remember the data module is pretty much the data editor if anybody says it that way. So I have a lot of tabs open already, and there's even a lot more than this. This is probably like 20 or 30% of the tabs that are available. All the tabs that are available are accessible by clicking on that little plus sign right there. I'm going to skip most of these, I think, but I'll go over some that I'm very familiar with really quick here. Like I said, the data editor is my weakness, and it's definitely not my forte. There's a lot of sections that I still haven't come close to figuring out, but like I said, just go over a few here quickly. The abilities tab is where everything from the move ability in the command card in the bottom right hand corner of StarCraft 2 to stim pack for Marines, any button basically almost that's in the bottom right hand corner of the StarCraft 2 UI when you're playing is an ability, and that's what's listed there, and everything making them work. Behaviors, the way I think of behaviors are as passive abilities that modify stats or speed and stuff like that. They do more than that, but they're usually temporary buffs. They can be permanent too, so it's basically passive things that are either temporary or permanent that affect units. Let's see, effects. In my opinion, is the most complicated tab in the data editor. Probably it does well, maybe the second most complicated. It's in the top 2 or 3 for sure. It can do a lot of different things. So honestly, there's not even a good example that I could give you, or a very brief explanation of effects that I could give you right off the top of my head. So let me jump ahead to footprints here. Footprints are like when you place a building, like when you put a barracks down in StarCraft 2 and a unit can't move through it, the footprint is what's preventing a unit from moving through it, and it's defined by little squares. So if a footprint says 2 by 2, that's like a supply depot footprint. A barracks, I believe, is I want to say 3 by 3, but I don't think it's a square. So it's probably like 3 by 4, 2 by 3. I don't know, but anyway, the footprint is what blocks things from being able to move. Now, if you're making a role-playing game, Blizzard's included an inventory system that that allows you to make items and bags and stuff, and that's what items and loot refers to. Loot, I'm not positive, but I think it's referring to the 3D models that are created if you were to drop an item on the ground. That's what they'd be represented by, as the information and loot. I could be wrong about that, so I'm sorry if I am. And the items section is specifically about what the items do if they're equipped and stuff like that, and it might even be where it defines if an item is stackable and stuff like that. Movers are, for example, when a marauder attacks, a unit is created. The missile that he shoots out is actually a unit, and the path that that missile follows is guided by a mover, and those movers define, like, you can make a marauder that shoots a missile that spins around in circles and stuff. You can do crazy stuff with movers that you definitely don't have to shoot just straight. You can do all kinds of neat stuff. Requirements and validators, I can't remember the difference between them off the top of my head, but when I think of them, in fact, they might even do the same things, but just in different places. But I know validators, for example, if you want something to happen to a unit that is like, for example, when they go below 50% HP, that's how you would define it. You'd create a validator, and there probably already one that exists that would only allow something to happen if something went below 50% HP. Validators don't tell anything to happen. They're just used in other places of the data editor, pretty much like conditions in the trigger editor, to say, hey, if this criteria is met, then do whatever you want to do. Turrets are, like, let's take the Immortal for example. The top half of the Immortal is a turret. It's like a separate thing that attacks from, like, a separate model or a portion of the model that moves on its own and faces what it attacks. The missile turret for Terran, the top half of that is a turret. What else? I'm not positive, but I think the battlecruiser has turrets, but I could be wrong about that. Basically, anything that has to turn to face what it's shooting is 9 times out of 10, probably 10 times out of 10, a turret. So that's where you create them. Units are a lot of things. You would think that units are just like a zealot is a unit, so that's where it is, and that's where everything about the unit is. Well, there is a zealot that's a unit, and that's where it is, but not everything about a zealot is defined in units. Units, when I think of units, that's where all of the data that goes into a zealot is kind of grouped together. Actors do similar things too, and I don't know the best way to explain the differences between actors and units at this point. Different information is defined in each one, and every single unit needs an actor. A lot of things in the data editor needs an actor, but that's going into really more complex things than I want to in this first tutorial. But there's a lot of information in units about units. Upgrades are things just like they sound like. The upgrade tab is where, like, attack upgrades for all the races are defined, and what I believe they do is defined there as well. And for example, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think requirements are the literal requirements in the game, in the StarCraft 2 game that you play, that are the prerequisites in game. And validators, while they are kind of like requirements, they are not seen in normal gameplay. So I think I just remembered what the difference was right there. So, but anyway, yeah, upgrades are the actual upgrades that exist in StarCraft 2 already for your units and buildings and stuff like that. And then weapons, like, you would think that the damage for a zealot would be defined, under the zealot in the unit tab, but in fact, it's the weapons tab that defines the damage of things. So, for example, the zealot has psi blades, and their damage is defined under psi blades in the weapons tab. So now that, even though that seems a little odd, and you'd be like, why did they do it like that? Well, that way it allows you to give a single unit multiple weapons, and you can you can modify things to where you swap what weapon a unit has, therefore it can have different, attack power at different times and stuff like that. So anyway, that's what weapons are for, basically. Campaign data, I think we're going to skip because just cause I usually don't touch this stuff, and yeah, I'm not even familiar with the vast majority of it, so even if some of it's pretty important, I don't know if it's definitely not basic, so yeah, I'm just going to skip that. Actor data, like I was saying earlier, actors are pretty complex. I'll go here really quick just to show you something, just to give you a little snippet of what kinds of things actors are. If you right click the white space here for any, when you're in any tab, including actors, you can usually say, hey, create new whatever tab you're in. So in the actors tab, you can go and right click and go to add actor. You can give it a name and an ID. The ID is what the code refers to everything in. It's what the code in the background refers to everything as, and there can't be spaces in it. So if I were to type, tutorial actor, and I click suggest, it would use the same name, but it would take the space out because the spaces can't exist in the code in the background for names and stuff, or at least for the IDs. Anyway, but what I wanted to show you here is actor type. These are all the different things that actors can be. Like, for example, if I wanted a doodad to show up in the terrain editor, I'd create a doodad actor, and once I was done setting one up, boom, you have another doodad to choose from in the trigger edit. I'm sorry, the terrain editor. Same thing for units. Even though there's a separate unit tab, you need a unit actor before it's before you're going to be able to create a completely custom unit. But that's, again, pretty darn complex. Don't need to worry about that for a while. So let's continue on here. All right. Attach methods. There's lots of attachment stuff in the data editor. I know somewhere that you can set up, attaching models to units and stuff like that to make things look cool. But I'm not sure if that's where it's done. That might be where it's done. That might be where it simply defines what attach methods do, but that's pretty complex. All right, let's go to art and sound data. This is some more simpler stuff. Buttons actually is not what it sounds like exactly. You would think buttons might define what buttons do or something like that, but that's not the case. The buttons tab defines the art and text associated with buttons. For example, let's say we looked up the attack button. It would show the icon that represents that button, and it would show, in fact, this is one of the most simplest tabs, so let's go ahead and look at this really quick. There's lots of stuff here, but and it might look a little intimidating. I'm sure the data editor looks intimidating so far, but don't freak out. You're fine. Anyway, this is where you choose an icon. Let's look at attack, for example. I'm sure you're all familiar with that being the attack icon. It's not the same color as you're familiar with, but that's the attack icon. The reason it's this color is because I've defined pinkish or purplish as what transparency shows as in my editor. So everything that's transparent shows up as pink. And basically what they do is they tint these icons to your race's color. So white changes to whichever race you're playing, and boom, you've got your attack icon. But anyway, that aside, that's the icon, that's the name of the button, and tint by race being enabled allows it to be tinted, and boom, there's the tooltip for your attack button. If you change that right there, everyone's attack button would have a brand new tooltip, and that's where you do it. And that's where you define a hotkey for a button. Now, if you've got the same hotkey for two different buttons that's displayed on a unit simultaneously, you're going to have issues. I think one of them will trigger and allow you to use it as the hotkey, and the other one won't. But anyway, let's continue on. So digital sound effects, there's sounds down here, and I don't remember off the top of my head what the difference between digital sound effects is and the regular sounds tab, so I'm just going to skip that for now. Lights are where the lighting effects in the game that you have to choose from are defined, like different planets in StarCraft 2 have different lights and colorizations based on what they wanted it to look like, and that's where all the details of that are defined. Models. Well, let me explain this really quick to make sure you guys understand this. Models. This is where, just like it sounds, models are defined and used. But let's say you wanted to put a sphere in your game, and you imported a sphere. You could not use that model until that model was defined in the data editor on the models tab. So this is where you would do that. And when I go to the import module in a little bit, I'll bring that up again probably. Reverb effects has to do with sounds. Don't know too much about that off the top of my head, so that's all I'm going to say about that. Now sounds. Similar to models, if you wanted to put a custom sound into the game, you'd import your sound in the import module, and then you would go to the sounds tab, right click, add sound. You give it a name and choose. Honestly, only this looks like a lot of, well, actually that's not the right thing. Anyway, never mind. You just right click and make a sound, and you would define your imported sound right there. It would be blank if you made a new sound, and you would just right click and add and choose your sound that you imported, and then you'd have access to it. You could, in the trigger editor, you could say play sound when something happens, and just type in the one that you added here in the data editor, and boom, you could play sound. The next thing is sound tracks. So sounds are not just sound effects. The music in the game is included under sounds as well. The only difference is when you add the sound, you would choose music right there, and that way it knows it's a music track. And when you're in soundtracks, you would simply define one or more music tracks. Actually, I think you could do more than music, but honestly, that's all I've ever done. You could define multiple sounds for one soundtrack, and then if you wanted to play custom music or play, specifically chosen music in your game, you would say play this soundtrack, and if your soundtrack had more than one music file in it, when you play that soundtrack, it would randomly choose one of the tracks and you can even define the weight of what it chooses randomly. So you could give a 90% chance for one track to play and 10% for another one, or something like that if you had two soundtracks or two sound files in a soundtrack. Textures, this could be a couple different things, so let me look at this really quick. I looked this up earlier and I couldn't find a Zealot, so I don't know why that's not there. I wanted to say that these were the textures for the units and everything in the game, but I mean, and that's what it looks like. Maybe Zealot's just called something else, but if Zealot does indeed exist somewhere and it's just not called a Zealot for whatever reason, basically what you would do is if you change the texture there, I do believe it would show the texture you changed it to on the model that uses that texture, but I could be wrong about that. But anyway, let's move along. I'm taking quite a long time in this data editor for the first tutorial, so. But like I said, I'm just trying to make sure you know where some things are, and there's a lot to find in the data editor. So terrain cliffs and cliff meshes are there. Usually you won't be touching that kind of stuff. That would probably be really advanced stuff. Fog of war data, I believe that's where you can define like the color of the fog at an absolute minimum. There's a few other things there, but like it says, it's just for the fog of war. Terrain types, that is where the this isn't where you have to go to change what terrain is being used in your map if you want to change what you chose at the beginning when you made the map, but you can do it here as well. You can define what terrain 2D art files, like textures, are used by each terrain. Like if you wanted to put custom terrain in your game, this is where you'd go and you'd define the art asset in here for terrain, I believe. There's lots of other options obviously as well, but like, let's see here, loading screen, it's weird to be there. So yeah, might be way too advanced to worry about right now. Yeah, let's just skip this for now. But lots of stuff there for terrain, obviously. Okay. Terrain roads define what roads I believe will be allowed to show in certain terrain sets. Actually, I take that back. These are defining the road textures in the terrain editor for the different kinds of roads, and you can make new ones. You could add a new texture to the game for a road. It would be pretty complex probably, but and that would allow you to add custom roads of your own type quickly and easily to your map. Alright, water defines the different types of water and all the attributes going along with them that you have access to in the terrain editor, or the terrain module, whichever you want to call it. And then advanced data, I think I'm going to completely skip advanced data because this is a basic tutorial. So that's the data editor. A quick overview. Obviously there's a lot of information to grasp. It's taken me literally years to get to the point that I am, and obviously, like I said, the data editor is my weak part of the editor, and there's a lot that I still have left to learn. So if it looks intimidating, don't worry about it. You can do a lot with all the other sections of the editor and not even touch the data editor and do some amazing things. So let's move on to the text module. They add a lot of features to the text module here in 1.5. The most notably, as far as I'm concerned, is the ability to add font styles and use custom fonts. So another thing you could do in the import module is import a custom font, and then boom, after you save your game, it should show up here. And you can define the size of the font, and you can define where it's justified to. Now, one thing that I want to mention here really quick while I'm talking about this is, if it's obviously centered right here in the preview, but this justification will not take effect unless you check inline justification. So I think the justification is completely irrelevant, actually, that you set here, unless there's a check right there. And so far, Glow doesn't seem to do anything. I can't wait until that's changed, though, because that'll look really cool. But so anyway, that's where you can import fonts and make them look the way you want to use in your games. And here's the import module that I've been referring to a lot. It's very simple. The whole module, all you do, you right-click, import files, choose stuff, and you're good. You just gotta, when you import something, it will show up as a color other than black. I want to say it's green, and then what that means is that you have not saved your map since you imported that file, and you won't really usually have access to that file until you've saved the game after importing it. And then if you right-click after you import something here and you highlight it and right-click it, you have the option to remove it, and then it'll show up in red until you save the game, and then it's successfully removed. So if you ever encounter problems when you're importing custom stuff, make sure you've saved after importing, or you might be encountering problems and be going, what's going on? I put this here, why can't I find it? And it's because you didn't save a lot of times. So that's the import module. Definitely, like I said, pretty easy. The AI module was added in 1.5, I do believe, and it's pretty new. I haven't messed around with it too much, but there is another tutorial that Blizzard has posted in their list of tutorials that they're putting together, made by the community, and the UI. Oh, anyway, as far as the AI goes, I'd recommend watching that to learn about it. That the guy in that tutorial knows a lot more about the AI module than I do. The UI module is where all of the XML data for the existing StarCraft 2 user interface exists. And I'll tell you what, like I said, I don't know any programming languages. I don't know XML. I can understand this just because I messed around with a lot of it for a while, and some of it is very easy to understand. It just says width, height. That's the number of pixels wide and high that this icon is. A lot of it is very it's pretty intuitive for the most part. Well, not completely, but some of it is. And then so anyway, that's all you really need to know at this point. Is this is where all the UI for StarCraft 2 exists, and you can figure out what is what. And like I said, I'll be doing it, hopefully a tutorial for literally not only just all of these modules, but multiple ones for each one to get into a lot of details. The cutscene module is another one that was just added in 1.5. Again, I don't know a ton about it quite yet. It replaced the previewer, and I knew how to use the previewer pretty well, so I know part of the cutscene editor. But there's another long tutorial. It's actually a PDF document that Blizzard released that is it explains a lot about the cutscene editor, so I'd recommend going and looking for that. I'll probably even put a link below to it, but don't hold me to that, I might forget. But yeah, I think that's just about it. So yeah, I hope you guys liked this tutorial. Thanks for watching. And honestly, if you know, the StarCraft 2 editor is really complex, and it might look intimidating if you're just getting into it, but I'm showing you a little snippet of a lot of stuff, and you definitely don't need to understand anything about some of the sections that I'm talking about to make a good game. So don't think you've got to understand everything that I'm talking about and everything that I'm touching on to be able to make something good. You definitely don't. But if you're interested in the specific section, hopefully now you'll know where to go to find what you're looking for, or at least have some sort of a lead. And if you're brand new, hopefully you'll understand where you need to go if you're looking for something. Hopefully you'll have some sort of an idea instead of just clicking randomly around. But hey guys, thanks for watching. Like I said, this is the first tutorial I've ever made, so if I'm doing something nuts and I'm not aware of it, or something's hard to understand, or you think I could do something better, definitely comment below and let me know. But anyway, again, thanks for watching. I know it's been pretty lengthy, so I appreciate it, and have yourselves a good day. Take it easy.